Hi everyone, Stjepan here. Today I'm going to show you my round 8 game from Liberec. This is also my last game with the white pieces in this tournament. And I faced a 1800 rated opponent whom I, didn't get to know well from his games when I was preparing. But I still did get some idea of what might happen in the game. I did choose to play the London system, and after d4 my opponent played d5, which I'm always happier to see than knight f6. Okay, bishop to f4, knight f6, e3, e6. When e6 happens, that means that there is no bishop f5 variations anymore, which narrows down the possibilities even further. And now we are sort of entering the main line of the London, the sort of classical approach by black, which I enjoy playing with white a lot, because there are a few variations in the main line which, in my opinion, all favor white. The only question is whether the position is going to be tactical or positional. In both cases, I kind of enjoy them. Okay, knight to d2, c5, c3, knight c6, knight g to f3. This is all very normal, has been played a million times. You can find several games of mine even in the playlist. Black castles, bishop to d3. And now there are a couple of ways for black to play. The main move is definitely pawn to b6, excuse me. And now previously, I've always played pawn to e4. If you've seen my game against Ena Cvitan, the Croatian women's champion, I played e4 and got a +5 position. Didn't manage to convert, ended in a draw. But the positions are very sharp and very interesting. Here I decided to deviate and I played queen to e2, which is the main move, but it's not what I usually play. It's kind of safer for white than e4, leads to slightly less complicated positions, but still more enjoyable for white. And here my opponent surprised me. After the game we talked, and he told me that this was actually his preparation. And I'm going to tell you at which point I think he told me his preparation ended. And I have to say, I told him that after the game. I had no idea this was a variation which he played. I thought black was much worse, and I would never go for that. Even if the engine, he told me the engine says it's okay, I don't care what the engine says, I'm not playing that. Let me show you. So the main move for black here is bishop to b7, which he didn't play. White continues rook to d1, and after rook to e8, white continues pawn to e4. And after that, bishop e7, e5 is the variation. The knight comes out to h5. White should be slightly better, but black's position is perfectly fine. My opponent played queen to c7, and queen to c7 is a weird move. The reason is twofold. Firstly, it still does not allow him to play pawn to e5, so he's not threatening e5. Secondly, the queen is sort of misplaced on c7, doesn't really do much. And thirdly, it allows me to play pawn to e4. Now, since he played it fairly quickly, I didn't play e4 straight away. I wanted to improve my position. I played rook to d1, which is a very normal move. If I do play e4, then this was my calculation. d4, knight e4, knight e4, bishop e4, cd, knight d, and if he plays knight d4, then I don't take the rook, of course, I don't take the knight, I play queen to d3. And now the rook is hanging, the knight is hanging, the pawn on h7 is hanging. If knight f5, then I take on a8 and I should be winning. If bishop to b7, for example, then bishop h7, and if king h8, queen d4, if the bishop is taken, that should be over fairly quickly. Also, I can just take on d6. I think the best move is queen c5 here and then queen d6. So if e4, the variations seemed okay, but I wasn't sure if I was missing something. I didn't want to end up with an isolated d pawn in some variations, and this is sort of hard to visualize. So to make sure I don't make any mistakes, I played rook d1 first, which cannot be bad. It's just a good position in any case. And he took on d4. This, again, he told me was his preparation. I took ed4, of course. Now the engine says plus 0.6 here, which definitely is okay for black. It's not much worse or anything, but I still don't understand why you would go for this. He played bishop to b7, and I played knight e5. So, I mean, I can just play f4 or knight d to f3. I thought my position was very close to winning here. Whenever you can play knight e5 without any consequences, and when you are able to support it, especially with bishop h4 ideas and then queen h5. But okay, he played pawn to h6, and again he mentioned this move when we were analyzing, that he saw this in his preparation. Again, I thought the move made no sense, but when you turn on the engine, now it says plus 1.5. So I'm guessing he may have messed up the move order somewhat, which he did mention, but I don't remember exactly what he said when we were analyzing. In any case, the engine now thinks white is better, and visually that's pretty clear to me. I castled rook ad8 and f4. Now what can he do? I don't know. He played knight e7, which was part of his preparation. That's what he mentioned. And I just went bishop to h4. What do you do here? I mean, all of my pieces are in play. I basically have one rook that isn't playing. The knight from d2 can be transferred to the game very, very quickly. But at the same time, this bishop is completely locked in. These two rooks as well. I have rook f3 ideas, queen h5. Bishop f6 is, of course, an immediate threat. He played knight to h7, and I simply continued queen to h5. Now, if you turn on the engine here, it says only plus 2 point something. It seemed to me that black should resign. That's far from the truth, because I always exaggerate the evaluations, but at least visually, I have two bishops, a knight, a rook, and a queen in the attack. He's defending with two knights. And of course here, the only move he could play is pawn to f6, because if he does nothing, then I can just take, or I can take on f7 first. Doesn't really matter. Whichever way I take, probably here. And he takes with the king, and I take on f7. He doesn't have time for g6 because of queen to h6. So he has to play f6, basically. f6. Okay. Now, after he played pawn to f6, I started calculating for a long time, because after I played queen h5, I'd already decided on what I was going to do here. And that's bishop takes h7, which may seem strange, but in my mind it seemed perfectly reasonable. And then when I started calculating it, I saw a lot of flaws. So here I had an hour and 20 minutes on the clock, and I spent maybe 30 to 40 minutes trying to figure everything out, and it was very hard. In the end, I did not play bishop h7. So, for example, if bishop h7, check. King h7, of course, has to be played. My intention was knight f7 with the follow-up of bishop takes f6, gf6, queen h6. And let's say he saves his rook, because nothing else makes much sense. If I can get the rook, then I'm clearly winning an exchange up. So let's say rook to d7. And now bishop f6. And the other option was knight takes d6, and after rook takes d6, my position is still fine. The only problem is knight f5. But the critical move was bishop f6, and after gf6, knight h6, or queen h6, and I couldn't see a follow-up. If you turn on the engine here, it says 0, 0, 0, 0, so I'd given up a piece for not much. For a human, though, defending against stuff like this seems very, very hard, if not impossible. Especially since if my rook comes to f3, the rook from f8 can never move, because I have queen f7, rook h3, and stuff like that. So these lines I was looking at for 30 minutes, trying to find ideas, but I couldn't see a clean win. And I just didn't want to give up a piece for nothing. And I especially didn't want to end up in this variation where I have to take on d6. I mean, it's still pleasant, but why would I trade off one of my best attackers? So, after having wasted a lot of time, I ended up playing knight g6, which is the most normal move in the world. Of course, if this knight is taken, then white wins on the spot, because he would have to play f5 here, and then the e6 pawn drops with check, and the position simply collapses. Everything collapses after that. Bishop f5 and so on and so on. So after knight to g6, he needs to move the rook. So rook f to e8. Okay, I improved my rook d to e1, no need to rush. He played bishop to c8, which is normal. And this is the other variation I was calculating, knight e5 here. Knight e5 threatens queen to f7 with bishop f6 ideas. So if, again, he does nothing, then I can play queen f6 and here, and probably just take on h7. So after knight e5, he needs to do something. The knight cannot be taken. If f e5, then f e5, the bishop is lost anyway. So let's say bishop e5. I go queen f7 check, king to h8, and rook e5, and again, black's position is completely unplayable. If rook f8, I take the knight. If not rook f8, I just don't know what to suggest. This is plus 10 or something. And it's not hard to find a win here. The queen is hanging, so the knight cannot move. The knight is hanging, so the rook cannot move. The knight cannot be defended because the rook on e8 is hanging. Knight f6 fails to bishop f6. Rook h5 is coming. It's just overwhelming. So the knight cannot be taken, which my opponent saw, and the only sensible move is knight to f5, which he played. And now I couldn't find a follow-up. Now it's even harder to take this knight because I can take on d8 eventually. So I didn't have to move it. I did end up moving it, but I shouldn't have. One nice idea which I saw in when I was analyzing the game, I didn't consider this during the game, is bishop to f2. And if f e5, then f e5, bishop to f8 or e7, and just g4. And once the knight moves, bishop to e3. Now this is completely winning according to the engine. For humans, I don't know. I have queen f7, I have bishop h6, I have rook f7. The other rook would come into play. I can also play knight f3, h4, g6. But when you're playing the game, it's not easy to visualize all of that. And I probably would not have gone for this. I probably would not have given up a piece for this. The other option, which I did consider as the main candidate, was knight d to f3. Now, if f e5, then bishop d8, and this should be a good position. Again, if here, then here, and everything should be collapsing quickly. And if knight f8, which the engine thinks is the best move, then I simply go king h1 with the idea of g4 eventually. F e5, bishop d8, queen d8, f e5, bishop e7, and g4. And here there is no way to save the knight, so g6, maybe queen h3, knight h4, takes, and just doubling up the rooks, either rook f3 or sorry, rook e3, because the rook is hanging, and just this. This again should be winning. But I blundered here. I played my knight back to g6. I wanted him to take on h4, and I wanted to recapture with the knight to provoke f5 and give myself queen g6 ideas. The problem is that he doesn't have to take on h4. He did in the game, which ended up fitting into my plan perfectly, and I got a great position. But if you play something like queen f7 or knight f8, let's say queen f7, then I have to move my queen away to g4. The other knight comes out to g5. Now both knights are hanging. Maybe knight e5, f e5, fg, I don't know, e4. This is, at least for me, impossible to see during the game. It's just calculating all of this without making any mistakes is just very hard. I'm just showing you one line with one option, but after queen f7, queen g4, he doesn't have to play knight g5, and it just gets very complicated. So he could have gotten a playable position with either queen f7 or knight f8. But after knight g6 he obliged and traded off his only good piece, to be honest. His knight on f5 is what's holding his position together. He took, I took, and now he made it even worse. He played pawn to f5, which is exactly what I wanted. He should have played knight f8. And after something like knight f8, queen h5, queen f7, maybe rook f3, preparing rook g3 or rook h3. But he played f5. And now, strategically, white is winning for a very simple reason. This bishop is no good, and this square is amazing. Of course, black gets to put in his knight into e4, but that's not as powerful. My king is much better defended, and the knight on e5 is going to be controlling these two squares, which in conjunction with my queen and with my rooks could be dangerous. And of course, once your opponent plays f5, this is actually a good positional exercise. When f5 is played, there's only one thing you need to bear in mind, and that's you need to prepare g4 as soon as possible. His king is on g8, so you need to play king h1, rook g1, h3, g4. Once you play g4 and it's overprotected and you can continue with g5 and just blast the position open, you should have some tactical chance in the position, which is exactly what happened in the game. So for now, critical strategic points, bad bishop, critical positional points, e5 square, and the g4 pawn break. Also, I have a backup plan of playing b3, c4 with rook c1 and breaking through on the queen side. So, in my mind, even if g4 fails and he manages to prevent it somehow with, for example, h5, g6, knight f6, knight g4, something like that, then I can play for b3, rook c1, c4. Okay, but I started with knight f3, I want to control e5. Knight to f6, knight g to e5, rook f8. To be honest, I don't really know what rook f8 was about. Maybe he wants to play rook f6. At some point, I don't know. I just continued with my plan h3, knight e4. Here, yeah, I need to stop for a second because my queen is hanging. He's threatening bishop e7. So I can either play rook e2 or rook d1. I ended up playing rook d1. I should have played rook c1, actually, because it helps b3, c4. So rook d1 doesn't make too much sense. But since my position is good, I just wanted to make sure that everything was protected. Not that anything can attack my d3 bishop, but that's just something I do. Sometimes I protect my only loose piece for no clear reason. Okay, bishop e7 attacks my queen, the queen drops back, king h7, and now I continue. King h2, bishop d7, rook to g1. Okay, he played rook g8, of course he sees what I want to do, and now g4. If that's taken, then the game should be over immediately, even though black's bishop becomes better if this pawn is gone. So for example, takes, and takes, and takes, and takes, and the king drops back. Even though this bishop is now a good piece, I don't think that's enough to save. Yeah, this is checkmate, I'm sorry. I don't need to do anything fancy. I don't even have to recapture this pawn, it's just over. So with my knight on e5, it's over immediately. So that cannot be taken, basically. So my opponent played pawn to g6, which is okay. And here I rushed things and I almost allowed him to get away. In fact, an engine probably would have gotten away after what I played here. The only variation I saw in my mind was, ooh, okay, I play g5, he takes it, and I win. The problem is that I was relying on my c4 break too much, and I ended up playing g5. What I need to do is, I need to play c4 straight away to sort of create two battle fronts. If I play c4, then he should take it. So he takes, I take on e4, fe4, queen e4. Okay, bishop c8 with the idea of bishop b7 has to be best here, and I just go queen c2. And now I continue h4 and stuff like that, and h5. I can even go king g3, rook h1, and then h4, h5. So I need to play this patiently. I had about 25 minutes on the clock. I don't know exactly. I think my opponent had less than me, but he wasn't in time trouble. And I played g5. Now, the problem with g5, which I didn't take seriously, is h5. In my mind, this meant, oh, nice, I get the h5 square, the h4 square for my other knight. That means that he's going to have to spend a ton of time either doing this or this to get rid of the knight on e5. And if he ever plays bishop g7, I take on g6. If he has to move his queen, his rook, play bishop d8 and bishop c7, then by that time I probably will have won the game already. Not to mention that I can play knight f7 and knight h6, and that should spell disaster. In fact, there is no clear way to win from here. At least the engine doesn't see it. Again, that doesn't mean that my opponent wouldn't have blundered or that I wouldn't have found a practically good idea, but still. And also I had the backup plan of rook c1, and as I said, if for example b5, b3, I don't know, let's say rook g7, c4, bc, bc, dc, rook takes, queen b7, this seemed good enough. I mean, I have these ideas, pressure on g6, I have ideas of queen c1 and rook to c7. This just seemed overwhelming to me. The engine thinks black is fine, which you have to be extremely good to understand that. And even if you are, and even if you do think and believe that black's position is playable here, then for a human it will still be much harder to play than white's position. However, my opponent blundered. I guess he was afraid of knight h4 ideas and knight f7 ideas too, and he took. And after he takes, it's just all over. And it's immediately over. There is no defense now, because I have the following sequence, which I'd calculated before planning to go rook g1 and king h2 and h3 and g4, and that's bishop takes knight, removing the defender of the g5 pawn, d4, knight g5, the knight has to be taken, rook g5, and now there's a simple threat of queen h4 and rook d to g1 winning the game. It's unstoppable. He played bishop e8, I played queen h4 check. If he doesn't play bishop e8, I play queen h4 check and rook g6 and win straight away, but this wins as well. Queen h4, king g7, rook d to g1, and there are no moves here. There is nothing. There's absolutely nothing black can do here. He played king f8, and now takes has to be taken because the queen is hanging. And if king f7, I can go queen h7 check, and if rook to g7, then knight e5 check. So bishop takes. Here every move loses, but he played rook d7, which is a mate in 3. Queen h8, king e7, queen f6, and after king d6, queen to e6 is mate. After king to e8, rook to g8 is mate. So he resigned after queen f6. I think this was a flawed attack. It definitely was. Once I got my knight into e5, I should have won this way quicker. After knight f5, going back to g6 is the biggest mistake I made. And I shouldn't have been afraid of having my knight hanging on e5 if I knew that the knight cannot be taken, which I did know. So, yeah, I'm not happy with this game, but one good thing is that I now know there's a variation with queen to c7. Once I looked in the database, it says this has been played 10 times, and black actually wins black won 3 games, white won 3, 4 were a draw. Ljubomir Ljubojevic faced this in 1997, so it's sort of an old variation. I couldn't find very strong players playing this, except for Robert Zelčić, which is one of the strongest Croatian grandmasters, who played it in 2018, and he did win the game. So if you're looking for a model game, then Žufić, Zelčić, 2018. Zelčić was black. Very interesting game. Yeah, okay, so not a perfect game, but I still managed to win. I mean, the attack was just overwhelming, so I could afford a couple of mistakes, I guess. Okay, thank you for watching. See you tomorrow for last round. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.